This day is called the Feast of Crispian. He that outlives this day and comes safe home will stand a tiptoe when this day is named, and rouse him at the name of Crispian. He that shall live this day and see old age will yearly on the vigil feast his neighbors and say, tomorrow is St. Crispian. Then will he strip his sleeve and show his scars and say, these wounds I had on Crispin's day. Old men forget, yet all shall be forgot, but he'll remember with advantages what feats he did that day. Then shall our names, familiar in his mouth as household words, Harry the King, Bedford and Exeter, Warwick and Talbot, Salisbury and Gloucester, be in their flowing cups freshly remembered. This story shall the good man teach his son, and Crispin Crispian shall ne'er go by from this day to the ending of the world, but we in it shall be remembered. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers. For he today that sheds his blood with me shall be my brother, be he ne'er so base. And gentlemen in England now abed shall think themselves accursed they were not here, and hold their manhoods cheap, while Denny speaks that fought with us upon St. Crispin's Day!
There you go. Splendid introduction by my friend Adam. How are you going, Bob? Can you, is your microphone sorted out now?
I think so.
Yeah,
yes.
you sound fine. You sound fine. All right, guys. This is a history stream, obviously. And I'm just going to put a little map up to start us off with. Where are we? Is it that one? Yes, it is. Okay. Boom, boom, boom. Excuse my boom attack, gents. Boom, 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 boom. Right, I think this is the map I want. There you go. There you go. This pretty much shows Henry V and his army's route from the town of Harfleur, which of course he captured after quite a long siege. It shows his route. He was marching towards Calais, which of course was an English town. Calais was an English town right into the 16th century. So, yeah, Calais was a very English town, and that was his objective. He didn't particularly want to fight a battle because he was heavily outnumbered by the French army. He brought something like 12,000 troops across to Harfleur from England. The majority of them were English warbowmen, English and Welsh warbowmen, but also a lot of men-at-arms and knights. And he had lost quite a lot of guys at Harfleur, mostly from sickness. And those people had mostly been sent back to England. So by the time he was doing his march towards Calais, which was basically crossing France and proving to the local people that the French king couldn't protect them, of course, which he couldn't. by the time he was doing this march, Henry probably had about 6,000 men, of whom roughly 1,000 or so were knights or armoured men-at-arms, and about 5,000 were English warbowmen. It's important to remember, of course, that the English warbowmen were not simply archers. They were professional soldiers, and in order to be an archer in Henry V's army, you were required to have, at very minimum, a helmet, a sword, a dagger, and also a buckler, which was a small shield. And that was a bare minimum. A lot of archers had quite a bit more armor and protection than that. And they were fully capable and expected to get involved in hand-to-hand combat when they weren't actually using their warbows. And the other thing that you often get the wrong impression of, particularly from films and TV shows and so on, is English warbows were bloody great hefty things. Some of them had a draw weight of 180 pounds, and 140 was quite common. And in order to be able to draw these and shoot them accurately, you had to practice from as a child. And indeed, English guys were all expected to practice every Sunday. It was the only thing you were allowed to do on a Sunday, apart from go to church. This turned you, just this practice, apart from whatever your day job might have been, which was also likely to be physical back then, this tended to turn you into quite a hefty and strong chap, because otherwise you couldn't draw 140 to 180 pound warbow.
Yeah. I think it's English longbowmen were some of the strongest. You could tell. I heard stories about, or I've heard, like, through English texts and stuff, of you would, when like you'd always be able to tell a longbowman because they were like the strongest people in the village.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure that's true. If you go on YouTube, you can go and check out a guy called Joe Gibbs, who is probably the leading modern English warbow guy. And he's a very solid individual, not the sort of bloke you'd want to meet on a dark alley somewhere.
Yeah.
if he had bad intentions. But do go and check him out. He's also done some quite good stuff about reconstructing some of the archery from Agincourt, etc., which we'll get into a bit later. So anyway, that's the map. As you can see, the French were trying to block Henry from crossing the river, but eventually the English army found a way to get across. But then they were absolutely cornered at Agincourt and had no choice but to fight at that stage. Now, there's quite a lot of controversy about the size of the French army at Agincourt. One or two authors have tried to reduce it hugely, whilst at the same time trying to inflate Henry's numbers. I've no idea why. I mean, but,
just makes no difference if you've got both of the armies bigger.
Well, no, what they try and do is make Henry's army bigger and the French army smaller.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's it, and they're mainly lefty historians, needless to say. The French army traditionally was said to have been 25,000 men. And it probably was, if you counted all the servants, etc., that the French had with them. For example, the French had about 10,000 knights and men-at-arms who were the top-ranked fighting people. And every single one of those guys would have had at least two servants. One of those servants was mounted, armed, and armoured. And they would have been expected to fight. The other servant was a page, and they weren't.
Yeah.
All right, so for that 10,000 guys, you've immediately got 10,000 of these armed servants as well. And then on top of that, the French had at least 6,000 or 7,000 missile-armed troops, which is to say crossbowmen and archers and so on. And there was also a lot of French levies there. So it is likely that the entire French army probably was 25,000 men.
Yeah.
Did all of those guys fight? No, they didn't. But something like 18,000 of them did. And as I said, Henry's army at best was about 6,000 men, about 1,000 knights and men-at-arms, and roughly 5,000 English and Welsh warbowmen. Anyway, we'll move on to a map now of the actual battlefield. Actually, perhaps we won't move on to that. Perhaps we'll move on to something else. One of the things I wanted to show was the main weapon of the knights, the English knights, that is, and men at arms, was a thing called a poleaxe, which I will give you a picture of just now. Assuming I can, of course. There we go. There we go. There you go. That is a poleaxe. Now, these things were about 6 foot tall. And as you can see, on one side there is an axe, there is a spear point at the top, and there's also either a hammer or a claw or something on the other side of it. And also the butt end of it also had a sharp point that you could use. And these were specifically designed to kill or incapacitate blokes in armor.
Yeah.
Swords were not desperately useful against blokes in plate armor, and everyone was wearing, or most people were wearing plate armor by the time of Agincourt in 1415. And a sword is not going to do you a lot of good against someone in plate armor. What swords were used for, if you had to use a sword, usually was things like half swording, which meant you held the sword in halfway up the length of the blade with one gauntlet, and you tried to find gaps in the armor, like the eye slits or under the arms or the backs of the knees and this kind of stuff.
Swords would be used in like earlier time periods, of course.
Yeah.
Earlier
The French, by the way, because most of them at Agincourt, they had learnt their lesson from earlier battles like Crécy and Poitiers. And most of the French, not all of them, most of them fought on foot at Agincourt because horses were extremely vulnerable to warbows because it was very difficult to armour a horse. So most of the French were fighting on foot, and for this, most of the French knights had actually cut their lances in half so that their lances were only about between 6 and 8 foot long, so that they could use them on foot.
Yeah. Which I mean, it's kind of smart in concept, but when you look at the actual how Agincourt turns out, yeah.
Well, the French actually had a pretty good plan for Agincourt, but the French nobles wouldn't follow it.
Yeah.
And also, Henry was a brilliant soldier and had picked an absolutely brilliant defensive position, which I will move on and show us now. That one. And so Henry had found this excellent position, and as you can see, on both the English are shown in red and the French in blue, as you can see, that both sides of the English position were pretty thick woodland, and obviously armoured knights and men at arms couldn't really attack through the woods very effectively, and certainly not if they were mounted. In addition, all the English bowmen had sharpened stakes, which they put into the ground in front of them, which would break up cavalry charges. That was their main use, because you can't get a horse to charge into a sharp, pointy object.
Yeah.
And the way these generally worked is they were like 5-6 foot long staffs, which were hammered into the ground and then sharpened. And also the weather aided the English because it rained very heavily the day before. And the ground in between the English and French armies was basically ploughed fields, and it turned into mud, which didn't help the French at all. Yeah, it didn't help the French at all. So initially, the two armies sat looking at each other, and neither side wanted to attack. Henry got fed up with this eventually, and so he advanced his army about 100 yards, possibly 200 yards, until he was within long bow shot of the French. And then he got his archers to fire a couple of volleys, very high angle ones, which wouldn't have inflicted much in the way of casualties on the French, because high angle bow fire wouldn't do that against armoured guys. They would mostly glance off. But what it did do was anger the French enough to make them start attacking. And that was Henry's whole idea.
Yeah.
You will also notice that he put archers in the woods on both sides of his army. And there were archers in between the men-at-arms and knights. Now, of course, for the French, looking at the English army, they didn't really take a lot of notice of the archers. They considered them to be peasants, which they weren't. They were yeomen for the most part, because England, of course, had gotten rid of the feudal system some time before Agincourt, because, as much as anything else, because of the Black Death, which caused the labour shortage. So the English didn't really have these kind of feudal peasants that the French still had, and indeed the French still had going up to the French Revolution in some respects. But yeah, so these guys weren't peasants, and as I said, they were professional soldiers. They were pretty well armed and fairly well armoured in many cases, and fully capable of getting themselves involved in hand-to-hand fighting. Now, there's been a lot of recent research about Agincourt and the use of war bows, etc. And it seems today, and this is what most of the military historians are coming to believe, and also with the help of people doing practical research and reenactment and so on, is that the main use of the war bow was at short ranges, fired very flat. Yeah. So what you've got to imagine is 5,000 archers who could easily, if they wanted to, fire 6 rounds a minute, very easily. You could fire a longbow a lot more quickly than you could fire a musket, for example, in the Napoleonic era. Twice as fast, and also probably twice as far as well, for a skilled guy. But they were using them to fire flat, straight into the French, and also into the French from angles. And if an arrow hit the cuirass, the breastplate of an armoured French knight, it was pretty unlikely to penetrate, very unlikely to. Same thing if it hit most of the helmet. But if you could get a hit on the sides of the helmet or the breastplate, or you could hit into the elbow joints, under the arms, and into the eyepieces and so on of the French helmets, then you could absolutely kill an armoured knight with a warbow arrow. And you've also got to imagine the absolute din of these things constantly hitting the advancing French knights and men-at-arms. And the fact that physically you're going to get staggered by these things hitting you. You know, something with 180 drop weight hitting you at, say, 100 yards, or even less sometimes, is going to be considerable, you know. And also, one of the things that's been found from practical experiments is the war also happens when arrows hit armor, is that the shafts often break, and you get the arrowheads and bits of the shaft, like shrapnel, going all over the place and splinters. And these things can also injure the knights. And so that is the way that people think that the archers were actually used, not firing these very long range volleys. As I said, Henry V got his archers to do that right at the beginning of the battle, but that was merely to get the French to attack. It wasn't to inflict casualties on them particularly. It was just to annoy them, really.
Yeah. But and like the French nobles always kind of like throughout the 100 Years' War, in my opinion, they were very cocky when it came to their tactics and their and like, for example, I mean, I think a lot of people do this. If you're on a massive like horse covered in armor and like you see all these kind of just like on the feet footmen just like approaching you and archers, you're gonna go, yeah, let's get him. So
yeah, and of course they weren't the French knights and men-at-arms weren't really aiming for the archers, because the glory was to attack the English knights and men-at-arms, and so that's what they were trying to do, which of course suited the English very well. The battle started actually with 2 French cavalry forces, which are shown on this map if you look at the screen, on both flanks, and they were supposed to get around the flanks and attack the archers from behind, but it didn't work. They weren't able to do it, and they got wrecked quite easily because, as I say, it was very difficult to armor a horse against a warbow, and the horses were very vulnerable. So both of those mounted attacks really came to nothing. They were shot up even before they reached the stakes that the archers had put up.
Yeah, and as an archer, kind of all you really need to do is take down the horse, and the knight's still a threat, but he's in the plough. Like,
well, if he absolutely, that's true. If he doesn't kill himself falling off the horse or break his neck, break his leg, or whatever he might else do, because falling off a horse in armor is not a good thing to do. So
no.
Although armor was nowhere near as heavy as like people used to think, all this stuff of people being lifted on the horses with cranes and so on is nonsense. A knight could leap into the saddle. There are videos you can go and find on YouTube of guys in full play armor doing acrobatics and so on, handstands and cartwheels, and you could do all that in armor. It was actually much better and much lighter than people thought it was in the old days.
Yeah. And like as you said, the plough field is a kind of a major factor in the defeat.
It slowed them down, which of course meant the archers had longer to fire at them.
Yeah.
To shoot at them, I should say. It also it jumbled the French. Their ranks got disordered.
Yeah,
and because
of the more massive mosh pit, pretty much of
absolutely so. And of course, if you're one of the guys in one of the rear ranks, the blokes in front of you have already churned up the mud, so it's even worse for the guys coming along behind. And of course, you're also going to fall over and trip over casualties that have been inflicted by the archers. And if you have your visor down on your helmet, which was called a bassinet in those days. If you have your visor down, you can't see much. But if you have your visor up, you're very liable to get an arrow in the face, which is going to spoil your whole day. So,
yeah. It's like you can't really. It's better to have the visor down in terms of like protection, as you said. But and then another. I'm just going to quickly say this. Another misconception of Agincourt about English, had almost completely archers, which is true, but then a lot of people forget that the French also had archers, but they brought crossbows the majority, and crossbows.
The French had more missile troops than the English did. The French had at least 6,000 archers of one sort or another. Like as you say, mostly crossbowmen, but they also had archers. But they had at least 6,000 of them. They didn't make very good use of them, because the French nobility weren't interested in them, if you see what I mean.
Yeah. I think the French also had a great bombard on the big cannons, and they fired it into their own ranks. It was just not good coordination at all.
No, it wasn't coordinated very well.
But then I guess not a lot of medieval battles are coordinated.
I think that's overdone a bit, to be honest with you.
But yeah, of course, like as you stated, the longbowmen. There we go. They had all their swords and like the small shields. So once they've run out of ammunition, pretty much, they can just go in and they're trained to. You get like 5 longbowmen. They hold down this one knight who's been trained to kill. They hold him down, and then they just like get in every single joint they can with these little daggers.
I beg your pardon. They had daggers, but they also had swords. You had to have a sword in order to join Henry's army. And some of them, there's one in the Wallace collection, I believe, which is actually an S-stock. So what it really is a really thick, pointy spear type thing.
Yeah.
And that is ideal to get into the joints between the armor, which is only protected by mail. So again, the elbows and under the arms, back to the knees. Also in that era, often the throat was only protected by mail as well. The bever thing that came in a few years after Agincourt for the most part. So these guys, and also they had axes and what have you as well, the archers. So that they, as I said, they were quite well armed. A lot of them were pretty well armored. It wasn't uncommon for them to have a coat of plates, for example, which was like overlapping plates, which you did up down the front. It was quite common for some of them to have leg armor, and even sometimes some arm armor as well. And that is shown in contemporary illustrations as well.
Mm.
And as I say, you absolutely had to have a helmet, and all of them also had to have a buckler, which was a small shield. And sword and buckler fighting was a traditional English type of hand-to-hand fighting.
Yeah.
Arbeyn's Sword of Agility is asking, did the concepts of English and French exist back then, or is that contemporary projection? No, the concept of English absolutely did exist back then and had for some time. And the concept of being French was growing, shall we say. France was still more divided than England, but the concept of English and Englishmen was certainly a thing back then. Although it is always wise to remember that Henry's army at Agincourt did include quite a number of Welsh archers as well as English archers.
Yeah. The Welsh were profound for they kind of half brought the longbow to the English.
They did. Yes, they did. It was originally
because they had the trees to make them.
Yeah, it was originally the Welsh longbow. Although by the time of Agincourt, most of the wood for English longbows actually came from Italy.
I actually didn't know that.
Yeah, Italian yew, I believe, is what they were after.
Yeah.
Again, go and check out Joe Gibbs's channel on YouTube. He's got lots of stuff like that because he actually makes longbows, and you can buy them from him as well. The yew tree from the graveyard says, yeah, indeed, they're associated with that. They're also really ancient. I think the oldest tree in England today is the yew tree.
Mm.
What are you saying here, Mitch? They lost their constable, marshal, admiral, 3 dukes, 9 counts, 9 major bailiffs, 3,059 knights and squires, master of crossbowmen, plus 3 of his sons, as well as 11 noble families wiped out and 2,600 commoners. Yes, the French losses were enormous at Agincourt. I mean, as Mitch has pointed out there, 11 noble families were totally wiped out.
Yeah, and it wasn't really the king of France. I'm not sure what you call him. He was the
the Dauphin was there. The equivalent of the Prince of Wales in England.
Yeah, I think he gets killed by
He was captured, I think.
Yeah, I know that the Duke of Bourbon and Orleans were captured, and that's a big loss because those two are some of the strongest houses in France.
Yeah, a lot more of the French would have been captured had not one of these local forces of French levies turned up, and Henry was concerned that he had so many prisoners that if this force attacked him from the rear, he would be, and the prisoners then rebelled, his army was still in danger of being destroyed. So Henry ordered some of these dudes to be killed, and his soldiers were very reluctant to do so. Part of the reason, of course, was it was against the rules of war back then, but the real reason they didn't want to do it is because that was money. Because you get money for giving these guys back, basically, if they were knights and noblemen and so on. And for ordinary English soldiers, this was one of the ways you could make money in war.
Yeah.
And it is worth remembering that in Henry V's time, at least 2 archers who started off as common archers were knighted and became knights. So that's worth knowing as well. I'm going to actually show a picture of some English archers. Where are we? That one.
I'll just be back. I'll just need to get some water.
No worries, mate. Boom, boom, boom. There we go. Yeah, screen. There we go. There you go. And that's a picture of some English archers, and I like that because what it shows is that they're quite well armoured. You can see they've got helmets, they've got mail shirts. And they're not sitting there as you often see in film versions of Shakespeare's Henry V, where the archers are just wearing like an ordinary jacket or whatever, which was very unlikely. But yeah, it was quite common for archers to have a mail shirt. It was also quite common for them to have a thing called a coat of plates, which was, as I say, a set of overlapping, iron or sometimes steel plates in a jacket that you could do up the front. So unlike a knight, for example, or a man at arms, you didn't need someone to help you get into your harness. You could do it yourself, which was, of course, important for an ordinary soldier who didn't have servants.
I think it's also kind of important, like we mentioned, that kind of it's not like the English didn't take losses. Like, of course, they were a lot smaller, but they did lose the Duke of York, which I mean that's kind of significant, especially for Henry V when his reign's under threat by English nobles everywhere.
Mm-hmm. Yep, absolutely true. I'm actually just going to look that up. Where are we? Yeah, the French losses were at least 6,000 killed, plus about 2,500 captured, whereas the English lost probably 112 men killed. The losses were extraordinarily one-sided.
Yeah.
Arbine, Sword of Virgili, had the English been ruled by the French since 1066, and this was their battle of freedom, so to speak? Not really true, to be honest. The English kings had stopped being French quite some time before this. Certainly by the start of the 100 Years' War, for example, they weren't really French then. So you can go back 100 years before Agincourt, and the English weren't being ruled by the French. And Henry V actually spoke English as his first language. I mean, he could speak French and he could speak Latin, like most educated people could, but English was his first language. But then bear in mind, of course, Henry's father had been a usurper, so a nobleman, but a usurper.
Yeah, and Henry was a bit of a embarrassment to the king when he was a prince, because he slept with the common folk, the peasantry. His best friends were peasantry, or the English version commoners. I don't know what you call them then. And he's a bit of an embarrassment, and because he gets injured in a battle. I think it's against the Welsh. He gets injured.
He got shot in the face. He got shot in the face. He lifted his visor and got shot in the face by an arrow. And only the fact that he was the king's son and had the best surgeons, and the surgeon had to make a special tool to remove the arrow from his face.
Yeah.
So absolutely, and again, that shows the dangers of lifting your visor in a battle in the medieval era when you're facing longbowmen. No name. He's saying a full plate harness of armor cost the equivalent of a Ferrari nowadays. That's probably true. Although bear in mind that a lot of men at arms were given their armor by their lord, and also the English archers were given their warbows. They were professional soldiers. They were given their warbows, and the king also had central factories making the arrows as well.
Yeah.
So you didn't need to be a rich man to have a good warbow in Henry V's army. You were given one by the king. but you had to prove you could use it before they take you.
I just did a bit more research on some stuff at Agincourt and Duke of York, his death. He actually saved Henry V, because I think the Duke of Alençon is attacking Henry V, and Duke of York like comes in, and I think he wounds Alençon, but it costs him his life, and they say it could have that could have probably saved the king's life.
Possibly, yeah. And Henry V absolutely did get stuck into the fighting. He was involved. He was involved in the hand fighting himself. He wasn't standing at the back just shouting orders.
Yeah, you've got the kind of the three versions that are displayed. You've got the the one you've just mentioned, standing in the back. You've got kind of the light footman who wears just like a breastplate and has a mallet for some reason. And then you've got kind of the fully cladded armoured knight, which he probably actually was.
Yes, he was. He was absolutely. He would have had the most up-to-date and best armour.
Yeah.
And we know for a fact he also wore a coronet crown on top of his helmet so that people would recognise him. And obviously he was wearing a surcoat, which was a kind of jacket type thing that went across the top of your armour, which had the royal arms on it. So you couldn't really very well miss him. So,
yeah.
And it was important that his soldiers could see him, of course. And Henry V, like all members of the aristocracy, was brought up to be a warrior from the time he was a boy.
Yeah,
I mean that was the main thing they did back then. But yeah, so he absolutely did get involved in the fighting. It's also worth mentioning that the English had a particular style of armor. I would suggest people go and look up. You can find some of his stuff on YouTube, but go and get his books. Dr. Toby Capwell from the Wallace collection, who's written 3 volumes now, I think, on English armor. And the first one is about the armor of the Agincourt period. And there was a particular style of English armor. Because the English, unlike nearly all the other knights and men-at-arms, tended to fight on foot rather than on horseback. The English did sometimes fight on horseback, of course, but and could do so, but they preferred mostly to fight on foot. And so English armour was slightly different to most of the armour you would find in continental Europe, and it was actually more extensive. The English knight was probably the best armoured knight of his day. So, for example, they'd have fully enclosed upper leg pieces. So, for mounted knights, it didn't really matter if the back of your leg wasn't armoured because you're sitting in a saddle. But if you're fighting on foot, it did. And so the English had tended to have fully protected backs of their legs, for example, with plate armour. And the same thing goes for the backs of their upper arms and this kind of stuff, which wasn't always the case. And they didn't have the shoulder protections, which I can't remember what they're called, pauldrons, I believe. They didn't have pauldrons of unequal size, which mounted guys who always fought mounted tended to have, like the French, for example, who would mostly fight mounted. They had unequal pauldrons, whereas the English ones tended to be the same size because you're fighting on foot, and you didn't want that stuff that wasn't right.
Yeah, of course, all of the European kind of nations at this time have their own style of armor. With the I think like the Germans trying to bring in the fear factor, the Spanish trying to bring in the looks with a bit of gold and things. I think the French just tried to mass produce it, and then the English made the best quality armor.
Well, the English also imported armor, of course, from Italy and places like this. And Flanders as well, although not apparently from Germany for some reason. No name is... hang on, let me get this right. Mitch is saying, to be a longbowman, you had to be quite strong and robust, and such men had no trouble in melee with tired French knights. Yeah, absolutely, Mitch. And we've been saying this during the stream, but yeah, you're completely right. No name is saying, to become a good archer, it did require access to good war bows, which you had to get yourself. The thing is that you started practicing for this stuff as a kid, and obviously when you were a kid, you didn't need a particularly big war bow to start, and then you gradually built up the power of the bow you were going to use, pretty much like a modern archer would do today if they're going to try and get into war bow archery. You're not going to start with a 180-pound draw weight bow because you won't be able to use it. So you have to build yourself up to it. And so, you did have to have bows, but then also bear in mind, like fathers would hand down bows to their sons and this kind of stuff. So, as always happens with weapons and so on. A bit like today in America, a father will often give his son his old rifle,
But yeah, but I think the English, they had kind of some, like, their regular kind of, what you'd say, regular infantry in modern day terms. They had their billmen, famous billmen.
Yes, they did. The bill was like a longer weapon than a poleaxe. So you could use it at a longer distance. You didn't have to be so heavily armored. The poleaxe was a weapon you were going to use at pretty close quarters.
And the billmen were always very effective against large hordes of horses and cavalry.
Yeah, they were good against horses, but the trouble with them was if they were less good against guys on foot.
Yeah.
Because if you could get inside the distance of the bill, then they were at a disadvantage.
That's why they always kind of travel in massive groups, though. Commonly, I think you'd see of like a front two ranks of bills, similar to kind of riot police. Like you see front two ranks of heavily armored to keep people back, and then the ranks at the third and the fourth rank, kind of to, like, if anyone gets through, to get them and kill them, or like to just like close range, really. You'd actually the English would sometimes, oddly enough, when they started to use crossbows, they'd have crossbowmen behind the bills to make sure no one would get really, really close.
Yeah, I don't think the English army did that at all, but they would have had archers behind them for sure.
Yeah.
The English army in 1415 made almost no use of crossbows.
No, of course not in 1415. But,
yeah. No, the English in 1415 they used the English warbow, Welsh warbow, if you like, but they didn't really make much use of crossbows at all.
No.
The French used both, but they didn't really use longbows to the same extent that the English did. They didn't practice with them.
They had the Scots Guard, which were Scottish longbowmen that would be sent over from Scotland to France.
Yes, something Écosse they were called.
Yeah, Guard Écosse.
Yeah, absolutely.
Those were like the cream of the crop for the French range, but apart from that, it was mostly mass-producing crossbows for use on the defence.
Yeah. No name in the chat is talking about longbows and how they lose they drop their draw weight over time, which I'm sure is true. But I think you've also got to remember that in a medieval English situation, you would have had quite a lot of guys who could make longbows. I would imagine that, like in any group of villages, etc., there'd probably be someone at least who could make longbows. Given they were so essential. So I don't think they would have been quite as... I mean, all right, they may not have been of the first quality, the stuff that people were practicing with. But they would have taught people their skill. And then, as I say, once you become a retainer of somebody, a lot of these archers were, as I said, they were professional soldiers. They were often retainers of sorted lords and this kind of stuff. Those guys would have provided them with good bows. And then in the English army that went across to Harfleur under Henry V, the king provided people with bows, providing they had a minimum of other weaponry and could prove they could actually use a longbow effectively. They were actually tested before they were signed up.
Yeah. You don't just accept anyone.
No, absolutely not. And as I said, these guys were professional soldiers, and Agincourt was actually the peak of this unique English form of warfare, with a mixture of knights and men-at-arms and archers, all fighting together, mixed in together, and on foot. And Agincourt was really the peak example of that. And Henry V, because he was an excellent soldier and an excellent general, used him extremely well. And had he not died of dysentery later on, he would have ended up the King of France. And England would have ruled France.
Well, yeah, the after Agincourt, the I don't know if he was the king or I think he was the father of the Dauphin, but he wasn't actually king. It's very strange, but
The
he
Dauphin,
had
yeah, because the French king was mad. He thought he used to go through periods when he thought he was made of glass, and if anyone touched him, he would shatter.
Well, I mean,
and the Dauphin was his son. Yeah, and the Dauphin was his son. The Dauphin was the equivalent of the Prince of Wales in England.
Yeah,
he was the king's eldest son who was going to become the king. And the Dauphin was the equivalent of that. And that was why the Dauphin was so important in France. It was because the French king himself was mad as a box of snakes.
Yeah, he actually, because Henry V dies in France, ironically. So the Dauphin, I don't know who it was, one of the head chief of staff in France at the time, who wasn't the king, invites Henry V to, I think it's a church, and he surrenders there and then. And the 100 Years' War kind of isn't one war; it's all just the tiny little wars put together between the English and the French. And he surrenders, and that's the end of the 1417 to 1420 campaign.
Yeah. Arbene's sword of agility, saying the arrows used at Agincourt seem to have been predominantly four-faceted, short bodkin or plate-cut arrowheads, made of wrought iron or very, very thinly case-hardened wrought iron. There's a lot of argument about this sword of agility as to whether the arrows were face-hardened. There is some evidence that at least some of them were.
Yeah,
there's some evidence that at least some of them were, but we just don't know because we don't have enough surviving to be able to tell.
Well, the longbow could fire, of course, multiple different arrows for different purposes.
Oh yeah, it could, but I mean, sword of agility is correct. Mostly they were using bodkin types because what they were trying to do was either go through thin or weak pieces of armor or into the joints between the plate armor.
Yeah.
And as I said, you've got to imagine 5,000 archers being able to loose easily 30,000 arrows in a minute.
It's almost like a machine gun.
Yeah, you just couldn't imagine it. You could not imagine it. We couldn't even recreate it today.
No, it's they were incredibly effective. Agincourt's really, of course, their time to shine, and that's what everyone remembers them for. But throughout every single medieval war, longbows were feared by their opponents.
The French eventually overcame them by increasing use of firearms.
Yeah.
And better organization and more men. Basically, what the French eventually had to do was themselves come up with a much more professional army.
Yeah.
And they also made a lot of use of early firearms. Early handguns, which were often little more than like a little tiny cannon on a stick. But you didn't need to spend a lifetime training to use it. And the same thing was also true of the crossbow, although the crossbow had a much slower rate of fire. No name, this is quite interesting. Imagine if Charles III proclaimed that all men in Britain would have to practice with the bow and ban football. No one would listen. More's the pity, if you ask me. More's the pity. But yeah.
It would be interesting to see that, though. Every single boy in every single school in the playground changes from playing football in the AstroTurf to firing
Yeah,
longbows.
I don't know. I reckon boys would quite easily get into archery, actually, but yeah.
Yeah.
Sword of Agility says the French did start to train some infantry in the use of the longbow in the late 1300s, but the king was most concerned about peasants having such powerful weapons. Yeah, I can well believe that. Absolutely. Because, of course, the French were still under the full feudal system, where the peasants were literally still tied to the land and basically belonging to their lord. It wasn't much different to Russian serfdom in the 18th century, you know. Whereas in England that wasn't the case. These guys were yeomen; they were basically free men by this stage. For which we can largely thank the Black Death, which caused the shortage of labour.
And of course, the peasants' revolt that almost kicked the monarchy out.
Yeah, it did. It did, but it was overcome eventually.
Yeah.
And even the peasants' revolt was more about reform than going around wanting to kill everybody. You know, the guys wanted a better deal rather than like everything destroyed.
Yeah.
Quite interesting from No Name. He went on a cruise this summer and made friends with an Aussie medieval reenactor. The French authorities would not let them reenact a full-ranked arrow volley at one memorial. Well, look, the French are not desperately keen on English tourists at Agincourt, even to this day, I have to tell you. They're not, and I know because I've been there.
Yeah. The French aren't keen on reenactments that much anyway. It's all the Belgians and the Netherlands that are like, yeah.
Yeah, well, the French lose quite a lot. So I mean,
yeah,
you kind of get, well, they lose to the British, anyway, but yeah,
it's just Normandy that seems to be the only one they'll let happen, mainly because it's sort of like the most important one for the French.
It's saving them after all.
Yeah.
But yeah, I by the way, I would have done a stream on the 21st for Trafalgar Day, but I managed to fry my computer last week. So I wasn't able to get ready in time to do the Trafalgar Day stream that I wanted to do, but that was an accident. Or we would have had a special Trafalgar Day stream as well. We will be doing a Waterloo Day stream, by the way, in June.
Oh. Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know. I think we've probably covered most aspects of this now.
Yeah.
Unless you had anything you wanted to bring up there, Bob?
No, not really. I mean, kind of the English really, they thrashed the French, really, is one way of putting it.
Yeah, and it was a great victory against the odds. As I said, there were about 6,000 Englishmen there, and there were at very least 18,000 French fighting men. At very least, and there were likely actually slightly more than that. And the fact that not all of them actually took part in the fighting was hardly the English guys' fault.
Yeah, England, part of the 100 Years' War, England seems to win all the battles, but they eventually lose because of themselves, really, because of the War of the Roses.
Well, yeah, the English are distracted fighting each other, and as I said, the French had to come up with a much more professional army, and they also made a lot of use of early firearms and this kind of stuff to try and negate the English advantage in the longbow. And you didn't need to spend years and years and years training to use an early firearm. You didn't even need to spend years training to use a crossbow. Even though, of course, the crossbow had a much slower rate of fire than the longbow did. But there was no, even up to the Battle of Waterloo, if Wellington had well-trained longbowmen, they would have had a longer range and a faster rate of fire than any of his infantry had. Yeah. But you just had to spend, probably 12, 15 years learning to do it, which you didn't have to do to fire a musket.
Yeah, as you said, we've covered everything.
All right, guys. If anyone in the chat's got any questions, ask them now. Because if not, I'm going to play us out of a tune.
Battle of Villeneuve, where artillery and armoured cavalry.
Well, that was where, if I remember correctly, that was where the French had a lot of Italian mercenaries who had they had the latest armor, including on their horses, which, as I say, were notoriously difficult to armor. And of course, the Italians had some of the best armorers in Europe. The English bought quite a lot of Italian armor. And I think that was that battle. And I believe, if I remember correctly, that the Italian armored knights managed to surprise some of the English archers, which was, always the thing with cavalry. If cavalry managed to surprise infantry are a big disadvantage. But I think you could argue that the English longbowmen and combined with the English knights and men-at-arms fighting on foot was an early part of the military revolution that really eventually saw the overcoming of the armored knight as the main guy on the battlefield. I think you could argue that they were an early part of that.
I always thought the English won the Battle of Verneuil, I think it is, not Villeneuve. Villeneuve's the French Admiral Agincourt community, not Agincourt, Trafalgar.
Yeah, Villeneuve was. I don't think it's spelt exactly the same, but
yeah, it's very similar.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, fair enough.
But the English win against the Dutch of Milan, Scotland, and France. They kill all of the commanders, and they capture 200 men, even though it's the Italians, the Scottish, and the French.
So you're saying the English won that battle?
Yeah, I'm looking at it here, 1424. I don't know if it's the same one.
Yeah, I'm sure it is. I'm sure it is. But I'm pretty sure that there was some Italian cavalry in that battle, Italian mercenaries fighting for the French, who actually did overrun some longbowmen who they surprised. What are we getting? Yeah.
English defensive musketry versus French cavalry and artillery.
Arbane sort of he's saying French was the mother tongue of every English king from William the Conqueror until Henry IV. Yes, although most of those dudes could certainly speak English as well. I mean, even Richard the Lionheart could speak English because he grew up in England. I think he spent his first 8 years in England.
And he never came back.
Yeah, but no, well, he came back after that, but he spent his first 8 years as a child in England. He could most certainly speak English.
Yeah.
And most of the army that he took on the Third Crusade, obviously not most of the knights, but most of the ordinary soldiers were in fact Anglo-Saxons. So, because most of the ordinary people in England were Anglo-Saxons. So, there were some Celts, but they were mostly Anglo-Saxons. No Name wants English defensive musketry versus French cavalry and artillery. I mean, probably English musketry was the best there was in the Napoleonic era, for sure. And the French cavalry didn't do very well against British infantry squares. So,
Yeah, the British can just form a square and they pretty much win. Especially when
it's like the archers' stakes at Agincourt.
Yeah,
you cannot get a horse to charge into a solid object like a wall of bayonets, for example. You just cannot do it. The only way cavalry ever really broke infantry squares was occasionally lancers could do it because they could their reach was long enough to like actually spear the infantry. Or more often, what happened was a horse got killed and skidded into the square and made a gap.
Yeah.
That was the most common way to break an infantry square. To summarize my question above, was Waterloo like a much closer run at Agincourt? Not really. bit more, Waterloo was a much more complicated battle because both sides had cavalry and artillery as well as infantry of various sorts. I mean, there were riflemen and light infantry on the English side. There were light infantry on the French side. So I'd say Waterloo was a much more complicated battle, and also it was a longer battle. Well, horses are too intelligent. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the thing about a horse is it's got a mind of its own. It's not a machine. So, and of course, war horses were extremely well trained in the medieval era. I mean, they were even sometimes trained to bite the enemy horses and knights and kick and what have you. They were very well trained. And very expensive as well. I mean, I don't know, like someone like No Name might know, but I'm sure a war horse was an extremely expensive thing to have.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think we've covered this, and we've gone for just over an hour. Happy Agincourt Day if you're an Englishman, and tough if you're French, I guess. I'm going to play us out with a suitable tune. We will be back, of course, on Saturday with Splendid Isolation, number 95, if I remember rightly, off the top of my head. That's at 9 o'clock UK time, 7 a.m. on Sunday, Eastern Australian time, which is 2000 GMT. But 9 p.m. Saturday. Please remember to like the stream because it helps, and do subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And also, we have a channel on what's it called? I can never remember. Yeah, I don't know. I'll get it in a minute. Where are we? Oh, don't worry about it. We do have another channel, which you'll find in the description after the stream. Okay, so I'm going to play us out this tune. Thanks for coming on, Bob.
Yeah.
Did you have anything you wanted to show, by the way?
No.
All right, no worries.
To Normandy, with grace and might of chivalry, their God for him wrought marvelously, wherefore England may call and cry. He set the siege for to save, to Harcourt town with royal array. The town he won and made afraid, that France shall rule until doomsday. Deo gratias, Deo gratias, Anglia, Re de pro victoria. Then went our king with all his host, to France fight all the French did most. He started neither least nor most, till he came to Agincourt coast. Then, forsooth, that comely knight in Agincourt field did manly fight. Through grace of God most mighty, he won both field and victory. Deo gratias, Deo gratias, Anglia, Re de pro victoria. Then dukes and earls, lord and baron, were taken slain, and that well soon. And some were led into London, with joy and mirth and great renown. Now, gracious God, he save our King, his people and all his good willing. Give him good life and good ending, that we with mirth may safely say. Deo gratias, Deo gratias, Anglia, Re de pro victoria.
Okay, that was the Agincourt Carol, which is a contemporary song from the period of Agincourt. And I took that one from an excellent channel called Anglo-Welsh Productions, which has got a lot of good music on it. Go and check it out. And thanks for joining us in the chat. Or if you watch it later on, as I say, please remember to subscribe to the channel. Subscribe to our Odyssey channel, which is our other channel, just in case YouTube gets rid of us, which is always possible these days. And we'll see you on Saturday if you're in Europe for Splendid Isolation. Go well.